When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at an iconic sword of the Islamic world, the scimitar. Since nothing is ever easy with weapon categorization, we get to start off yet again with some definitions. The scimitar, as we generally understand it, is a curved sword meant for slashing. However, there are a lot of curved swords across different cultures, languages, and historical periods that aren't necessarily called a scimitar. The saber, for example, is a back sword with a curved blade, and when looking at a plethora of examples, you can see many different cultures have different types of sabers. The main distinction between a scimitar and a saber is, well, whether it has Islamic origins. Essentially, scimitars are just one localized type of saber. The problem with that is that there are many different scimitars as well. You see, most swords seen as a scimitar are better described by more specific terms, but even then, these words are often just that region or culture's term for sword. The Persian shamshir is generally accepted as the origin of the word scimitar, but the scimitar also includes the Afghan pulwar, the Indian talwar, the North African nimcha, and the Turkish kilij. These swords have distinctions in their curve and their culture, but all get lumped into the same general category of scimitars. As a general category, rather than a singular weapon, the measurements of scimitars could vary quite a lot. Most measured from 0.7 to 0.9 meters long, though some could be over a meter long. The blade would curve backward, though the depth of the curve varied. Historically, curved swords have existed since the ancient period in various parts of the world, with swords like the Egyptian khopesh, the Iberian falcata, and the Greek kopis finding use in the Bronze and Iron Ages. There are different theories on why some swords were created with curves when straight swords already existed, but one of the strongest is that curved swords were better for light cavalry. Back in the 4th century BC, Xenophon of Athens, a Greek military leader, philosopher, and historian, recommended the kopis for cavalry, stating, "I recommend a kopis rather than a xiphos, because from the height of a horse's back, the cut of a machaira will serve you better than the thrust of a xiphos." Modern understandings of these tactics seem to support this, as piercing someone from horseback lodges the blade within the target, meaning the blade needs to be pulled back out if it's to be used for more attacking or defending. For lightly armored raiders or cavalry, those moments spent pulling a blade out left them vulnerable, so being able to slash through a target, even if the wound wasn't fatal, was enough for a rider to move on and continue the attack. While the rest of the Mediterranean dabbled in curved swords, most early Arab swords, known as saif, were straight, double-edged blades similar to a European arming sword. Arabic literature mentions the Mashrafiyya swords produced in Mu'tah, a city in modern-day Jordan. These Arabian swords were so highly valued that the Prophet Muhammad ordered a raid to the city to seize them. After the death of Muhammad in the 7th century, the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates continued to use the saif in the territorial conquests of Iraq and Persia, as well as Syria, Egypt, and Palestine. From the 8th to 13th centuries, the saif coexisted alongside curved sabers brought in from Turkic warriors in Central Asia, mostly imported by Turkic slave soldiers known as Gilman, that served in the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. This Turco-Mongol saber had less of a curve than the scimitar we think of today, but was very effective on horseback, and began to spread throughout the Islamic world. During the Islamization of the Turks in the 12th century, the scimitar known as the kilij became more popular than the saif, gradually displacing the straight sword for curved sabers. When the Great Seljuk Empire began to spread throughout Persia and Anatolia, their sabers further influenced weapon designs in the region. After the Mongols invaded most of the world in the early 13th century, their presence influenced other regional sword designs to mimic the Mongol saber. The Chinese Yuan dynasty, formed after the Mongol invasion, saw a wider adoption of the dao, a single-edged saber that itself had many variations. Back in Persia, the shamshir was developed across the 12th and 13th centuries, taking influence from the Seljuks and Mongols. Meanwhile, as the Ottoman Turks rose from the ashes of the Rum Sultanate in Anatolia, the kilij found great use in establishing the early empire. The kilij and shamshir continued to be the main weapons of the region, introduced to Europe through the Ottoman invasion of the Balkans in the 14th century. While the Ottomans exported many scimitars to Europe and Asia, Eastern Europe began developing their own, such as the carabella, which became the most popular sword form in the Polish army throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The French also took notice of the kilij during their conquest of Egypt in the Napoleonic Wars. Light cavalry officers noted the effectiveness and beauty of the shamshir and kilij, and it became fashionable for officers to wear. In 1831, the Mameluke sword, named after the slave mercenaries used in the region, became a regulation pattern for British general officers. The Americans also came into possession of these scimitars during the First Barbary War from 1801 to 1805, and officers of the US Marine Corps still use a Mameluke pattern dress sword today. Like most melee weapons, scimitars were eventually abandoned as armies modernized with firearms in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. After Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II disbanded the Janissary Corps in 1826, the kilij was abandoned for Western cavalry sabers and small swords, though it was kept for traditional and ceremonial dress. The scimitar's legacy lives on in a symbolic role, adopted as a symbol for the East and the Islamic world in general. The old flag of Saudi Arabia, used from 1938 to 1973, depicts a scimitar underneath the Shahada, though the modern flag uses a less stylized, straighter sword. Scimitars are featured in historical martial arts as well, though most practitioners just refer to them as curved sabers rather than scimitars specifically. Whether saber or scimitar, this sword was popular and pivotal for the many empires that rose and fell throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, and lives on today as an icon in media and gaming.
You see those warriors from Hammerfell? They've got curved swords. Curved swords.
In D&D, the scimitar is described as a back sword, with a curved blade measuring 0.6 to 0.9 meters long. Not having the damage of heavier swords, a skilled scimitar wielder could still hit vital areas. Present since 1st edition, the scimitar of older editions cost 10 to 15 gold pieces, weighed 1.8 kilograms, and dealt either 1d6 or 1d8 slashing damage depending on the edition. In 5th edition, the scimitar costs 25 gold pieces, weighs 1.3 kilograms, deals 1d6 slashing damage, and has the finesse and light weapon properties. On its own, these features come together to make the scimitar a pretty standard weapon in D&D, being one of 2 martial weapons that can be used in 2-weapon fighting unless you take the dual-wielder feat. If we look at the scimitar next to the other light finesse martial weapon, the short sword, it starts to pale in comparison. Yes, they do 2 different damage types, but there are hardly enough monsters in 5th edition that have resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities that make mundane damage type really matter. And once you get past that, the scimitar costs more and weighs more than the short sword. Now look, I'm not here to completely bash on the scimitar. Most classes that can viably use the scimitar will also have access to the short sword, but you won't have an awful time if you choose the scimitar instead. I mean, if my only complaint is that it's too similar to another weapon, that's still pretty good in my book. I just believe that even something as simple as mundane weapons should give players a chance to make meaningful choices about how they build their character. And as it stands now, the scimitar doesn't have any mechanical reasons to use it instead of the short sword. In the streamlining of 5th edition's rule set, a lot of the distinctions between mundane weapons were lost, and unfortunately, that includes the scimitar. If you want to build a dual-wielding character who slashes through monsters with ease, the scimitar will not let you down. But if you want your weapon choices to really matter in D&D, the scimitar could use some more properties to help it stand out. So, I'd like to look at some suggestions I came up with to help fix the scimitar in D&D. My first suggestion is to add a weapon property that allows the scimitar to inflict bleeding onto enemies. The video game Baldur's Gate 3 is based on the 5th edition rule set, but also added their own features to the game to make it a bit more fun. Some of those features were additional weapon actions tied to each weapon, which could be used if your character was proficient with the weapon. In Baldur's Gate 3, the scimitar has the Lacerate ability, which inflicts the bleeding status effect that deals 2 slashing damage at the start of the creature's turns and imposes disadvantage on Constitution saving throws. With this ability added to tabletop D&D, characters who use the scimitar would be able to inflict status effects onto enemies, something that mundane weapons currently lack. While I talk about these weapon properties in detail in an older video I made, I do also understand that adding a whole bunch of new conditions, actions, and bonus actions to the game makes it more complex for players and DMs to track and manage. Without the automation of video game mechanics, I'm not entirely sure whether the management these conditions add would be worth the cool effects they let players pull off, but I still think it'd be a good addition to try. My second suggestion to fix the scimitar in D&D would be to allow it to critically strike on natural 18s, 19s, and 20s. In 3rd edition, certain weapons had different interactions with critical strikes, where the general trend was that swords had a higher chance to crit, while axes did triple damage on a crit instead of double. While I've mentioned reintroducing this feature in my previous videos, the scimitar is a unique case, namely because I normally only suggest allowing this for natural 19s and 20s. But the scimitar needs something more than that to really stand out. As such, considering its lower 1d6 damage dice despite being a martial weapon, my recommendation is to include natural 18s as well as 19s and 20s for critical hits. This makes the scimitar much better at fishing for crits, especially for characters who are dual-wielding them. Most people might immediately jump to rogues as the main beneficiaries from this, but I'm already theory crafting a dex-based paladin who dual-wields scimitars, holding that divine smite until they roll that sweet, sweet crit. The biggest downside here, though, is in general balancing, as characters and monsters using the scimitar may end up critting too much. But personally, I think that just means DMs can use tougher monsters with cooler abilities against their players, so there are pros and cons to consider. My third and final suggestion for how to fix the scimitar is to give it a weapon property that grants a bonus on follow-up attacks. One of the advantages of curved swords historically was that while their slashes weren't as effective as hacking or piercing with a straight sword, curved swords had innate follow-through due to the curvature of the blade. As such, it makes sense to me for the scimitar in 5th edition to have a similar advantage, but figuring out how to grant that could be tricky given the limited action economy of D&D. 1D&D seems to be adding this through their weapon masteries, where they've added the Nick property that allows the scimitar to make an extra attack as part of the main attack action, freeing up the bonus action for other abilities. However, this could also be represented with something as simple as a +1 attack bonus to follow-up attacks with the scimitar, which would make it a fantastic weapon for fighters with action surge. However, much like my idea with the expanded crit range, this might make the weapon a bit overbalanced, so there may need to be some fine-tuning to the idea if it were to be implemented into the game properly. With all of that being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to fix the scimitar in D&D. If we left it alone, the scimitar would still be a good choice for players that want some specific flair on their dual-wielding character. But the weapons of D&D should have enough mechanics to make using different weapons feel like more than a simple reskin or a change from slashing to piercing. By adding in some or even all of the suggestions I put forward, the scimitar can start to feel like its own weapon, with its own features that make people want to use it. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the scimitar. An interesting weapon to research, the scimitar is one of the iconic weapons to use if a character wants to excel at two-weapon fighting. But by changing up a few baseline features, the scimitar can go from a heavier, more expensive short sword that does slashing damage to a crit-fishing king whose fluid motions make it easy to string together attacks. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the scimitar? Do you think it's fine as it is now? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward? Or did you have your own ideas on how to fix the scimitar in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. Normally, next week's video would be on the short sword, but since I already covered that way back at the start of this series, I'm going to move forward with the trident for the next breakdown. Maybe I'll revisit the series after 1D&D comes out, but let me know what y'all want to see as well. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.